Principal suspends millionaire girl. She burned her cloths in middle of campus. Then 3 helicopters landed. Enjoy this amazing story and comment below where you are watching from. The courtyard of Westbridge Academy basked in the golden afternoon sunlight. Rows of manicured hedges lined the pathways, and the fountain at the center of the courtyard sparkled like it had been carved from pure crystal. Students filled the space, their laughter and chatter weaving together into a symphony of privilege and confidence. For Aaliyah Scott, however, the pristine beauty of Westbridge felt like a facade, one that masked a system of exclusion and silent cruelty. She walked past clusters of students, their eyes flicking toward her for a moment before turning away, followed by hushed whispers and muffled laughs. Her grip tightened on her bag, but her expression remained neutral. Aaliyah had mastered the art of pretending she didn't notice even when the sting of their words cut deep. "Hey, did you hear what Charlotte said about her?" someone whispered from a nearby bench. "She called her Midnight," another voice replied, barely suppressing a laugh. Aaliyah's steps faltered slightly, but she forced herself to keep walking. She knew better than to give them a reaction. It was exactly what they wanted. At 15, Aaliyah was no stranger to the sting of microaggressions and outright mockery. As one of the only African-American students at Westbridge, she had spent every day of the past year feeling like an outsider. Her classmates mocked her skin tone, ignored her achievements, and dismissed her presence as though she didn't belong. What hurt the most wasn't the students. It was the silence of the teachers. They saw the way Charlotte Hayes and her clique targeted her, but they never intervened. Aaliyah suspected they didn't want to challenge the Hayes family, whose money had funded several of the school's new facilities. Aaliyah sat alone beneath a sprawling oak tree at the edge of the courtyard, her lunch tray untouched beside her. The sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air, but none of it felt like it belonged to her world. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a text from her dad. "How's school, sweetheart? Keep your head high, always." A soft smile tugged at her lips, but it faded as quickly as it came. She wanted to tell him the truth, that Westbridge wasn't the opportunity he believed it to be, that every day here felt like a battle she was losing. But she couldn't. He had worked too hard to get her into this school, hoping it would open doors for her future. "Just keep your head down," she whispered to herself, sliding her phone back into her pocket. It's only a few more years. But deep down, Aaliyah knew that no amount of time could erase the loneliness and frustration building inside her. From across the courtyard, Aaliyah's sharp eyes caught sight of Charlotte Hayes and her friends. Charlotte stood at the center of her group, her blonde hair gleaming in the sunlight like a crown. Her laughter rang out over the hum of conversation, commanding attention as if the world revolved around her. "Hey, Midnight!" Charlotte called, her voice slicing through the courtyard like a knife. Aaliyah stiffened, but she didn't look up. She knew better than to engage. "You hiding over there, or is the sun just too bright for you?" Charlotte continued, earning snickers from her entourage. Heat flushed Aaliyah's cheeks, but she kept her gaze firmly on the ground. She clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. Charlotte's voice carried on taunting, but Aaliyah tuned it out. Her focus shifted inward, to the fire that had been quietly smoldering inside her for months. This fire had started with every cruel word, every sneer, every indifferent glance from a teacher who should have known better. And now it was growing. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, but Aaliyah remained seated for a moment longer. As the courtyard emptied, she stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She glanced at the oak tree's sprawling branches overhead, as though drawing strength from its quiet resilience. She didn't know it yet, but by the end of the week she would make sure everyone at Westbridge Academy remembered her name. The cafeteria at Westbridge Academy hummed with activity, the clatter of trays and the murmur of conversations blending into a steady rhythm. Aaliyah sat at the farthest corner table, her back to the wall. It wasn't by choice, it was survival. The further away she was from the epicenter of the cafeteria's social hierarchy, the less likely she was to become its target. She kept her head down, picking at her food without eating. A cold sandwich and a carton of milk sat on her tray, untouched. Her appetite had been stolen by the weight of the stares she felt from across the room. At the center of the cafeteria, Charlotte Hayes held court. Her group of perfectly dressed friends surrounded her, laughing at some private joke. The sound grated on Aaliyah's nerves, but she forced herself to focus on the sandwich in front of her. Maybe today, Charlotte would ignore her. Maybe today, she would just, "Hey, midnight." The words rang out clear and sharp, cutting through the background noise like a siren. Aaliyah froze. Her stomach twisted into a knot as she felt the weight of the room shift toward her. She didn't look up. She knew better than to give Charlotte the satisfaction. "Are you fasting or something?" Charlotte continued, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Or did you forget how to eat?" The laughter that followed was loud and cruel. Aaliyah clenched her fists under the table, her nails biting into her palms. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but her chest tightened with every second. "Come on, Charlotte," one of her friends chimed in. "Maybe she's on a new diet. You know, just air and water." Another round of laughter erupted, louder this time. Aaliyah's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze fixed on the tray in front of her, willing herself to disappear. Charlotte wasn't done. She stood, her designer heels clicking against the tiled floor as she strutted toward Aaliyah's table. The cafeteria grew quieter with each step, the students sensing that something bigger was about to unfold. Phones began to appear, their cameras ready to capture whatever was about to happen. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest as she felt Charlotte's presence looming over her. "Don't ignore me, Midnight," Charlotte said sweetly, leaning down so her face was level with Aaliyah's. Her tone was friendly on the surface, but the venom underneath was unmistakable. "It's rude, you know." Aaliyah didn't respond. She stared at the table, her jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "Fine," Charlotte said, straightening. "If you won't talk to me, maybe I'll just help you clean up your table. It looks like you're done eating anyway." Before Aaliyah could react, Charlotte grabbed her tray and flipped it over. The sandwich, milk carton, and plastic utensils tumbled to the floor with a crash, the milk splattering across Aaliyah's shoes and the surrounding tiles. The cafeteria erupted. Gasps and laughter filled the air, and the sound of phones capturing the moment added a layer of cruel finality. Aaliyah stared at the mess on the floor, her mind blank with shock. The humiliation pressed down on her like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. "Oops," Charlotte said with a smirk. "My bad." Aaliyah looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Charlotte's smug face. For a moment, everything else faded away. The laughter, the stares, the phones. It was just her and Charlotte, a predator and her prey. But something shifted. For the first time, Aaliyah didn't feel small. She didn't feel like prey. The fire that had been smoldering inside her roared to life, and she felt its heat coursing through her veins. Without a word, Aaliyah stood. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, silencing the room. All eyes were on her now, waiting to see what she would do. Charlotte crossed her arms, her smirk widening. "Oh, are you finally going to say something? Let me guess, you're going to tell the teacher? Good luck with that." Aaliyah didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any words could have been. She turned and walked toward the cafeteria doors, her steps steady and deliberate. The room buzzed with whispers as she left, but Aaliyah didn't care. She had already made up her mind. The cool air outside hit Aaliyah's face like a slap, but it cleared her head. She walked to a bench near the edge of the courtyard, her mind racing. She thought about Charlotte's smirk, the laughter of her classmates, and the indifferent gaze of the teacher in the cafeteria. She thought about her father's text that morning. "Keep your head high, sweetheart." Her fingers clenched into fists as she replayed the scene in her mind. She couldn't let this go on, not for herself and not for anyone else who might face the same treatment. But what could she do? How could she make them listen? Her gaze drifted to the blazer hanging over her arm. It was pristine, untouched by the chaos inside, and yet it felt tainted. To her, it symbolized everything wrong with Westbridge: conformity, silence, and a refusal to confront the ugly truths beneath the surface. The idea came to her suddenly, hitting her like a jolt of electricity. It was bold, reckless, unthinkable, but it was the only way to make them see her, to make them understand. Aaliyah stood, her resolve hardening with every passing second. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding as the fire inside her grew brighter. "Let's see if they're still laughing after this," she whispered to herself. By the time Aaliyah returned home that afternoon, her mind was racing with plans. The humiliation in the cafeteria replayed over and over, but instead of letting it consume her, she used it as fuel. She sat at the edge of her bed, her hands folded tightly as her thoughts solidified into a single, undeniable conclusion. They wouldn't ignore her anymore. Her eyes drifted to the corner of her room where her Westbridge uniform blazer hung neatly on a hook. The sight of it made her stomach churn. The blazer had once been a symbol of her family's hard work and sacrifice, a ticket into a world of opportunity. Now, it felt like a straitjacket, suffocating her in silence and conformity. Aaliyah rose and walked to her closet, pulling down her school bag. She opened the drawer in her desk and retrieved a small lighter, a practical, inconspicuous object that had never felt dangerous before. She turned it over in her hand, the metal cool against her palm, and tested its flickering flame. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. She slid the lighter into her bag, her resolve hardening. "They'll remember this," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "They'll remember me." As Aaliyah zipped her bag shut, she heard the familiar sound of her father's car pulling into the driveway. She glanced at the clock. It was earlier than usual. A pang of guilt tugged at her chest. He had left work early for her, for a daughter who hadn't been able to tell him how bad things really were at school. "Hey, sweetheart," Darius Scott called as he walked through the door, his voice warm and comforting. He stepped into her room moments later, holding a small bag from their favorite deli. "Figured we could have dinner together tonight." Aaliyah forced a smile. "Thanks, Dad. You didn't have to." "Of course I did," he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "How was school?" Her smile faltered. She opened her mouth to tell him everything, to finally lay bare the weight she had been carrying. But then she saw the tired lines on his face, the shadow of stress in his eyes. He had enough on his plate without worrying about her. "It was fine," she lied, her voice steady. Darius studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "You know, Aaliyah, you don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to lean on people who love you." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "I know, Dad." The next day, Aaliyah walked into the school courtyard with her bag slung over one shoulder. The crisp morning air carried the familiar hum of students mingling before the first bell, their laughter and chatter blending into the usual background noise. But to Aaliyah, everything felt heightened, the sights sharper, the sounds louder, the weight of her actions heavier. She clenched the strap of her bag tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. As she passed groups of students, she caught glimpses of Charlotte Hayes holding court once again. Charlotte's laughter rang out above the crowd, carefree and cruel. Aaliyah didn't look at her directly, but she felt the smirk aimed at her back, as if daring her to do something. Aaliyah stopped in the center of the courtyard, her movements deliberate. She set her bag on the ground and unzipped it, pulling out the blazer that had become a symbol of her frustration and anger. The sunlight caught the fabric as she held it up, and students began to notice. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. Phones appeared almost instantly, students raising their cameras to capture whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Aaliyah could hear the murmurs around her growing louder, a buzz of curiosity and confusion. She reached into her bag again and pulled out the lighter. The small flame flickered to life in the cool morning breeze, and gasps rippled through the crowd. "This uniform doesn't represent me," Aaliyah said, her voice steady and loud enough to carry over the courtyard. "It doesn't represent fairness or justice. It represents silence, conformity, and a system that lets people like me suffer." She lowered the lighter to the edge of the blazer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the fabric caught fire, the flames licking hungrily at the material. The crowd froze, their murmurs silenced as they watched the blazer burn. Teachers began rushing toward her, their shouts filling the air. "Aaliyah, stop this immediately!" one of them yelled, their voice tinged with panic. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She held the burning blazer aloft, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She could see their stunned faces, their wide eyes, their phones recording every second. For the first time, they were truly seeing her, not as a victim, but as someone who refused to be silenced. The flames consumed the blazer, reducing it to ash that crumbled in her hands. Aaliyah let the remains fall to the ground, her expression calm and resolute. "You'll remember my name now," she said softly, her words carrying across the courtyard. The teachers reached her moments later, their voices frantic as they ordered her to follow them. The crowd began to buzz with energy again, students murmuring and sharing videos of what they had just witnessed. Aaliyah walked away with her head held high, even as the weight of what she had done settled on her shoulders. She knew the consequences would come, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. The walk to the principal's office felt like a gauntlet. Students whispered and pointed as Aaliyah passed, their faces a mixture of shock and admiration. Phones were still out, notifications pinging as the videos of her protest spread like wildfire. When she reached the heavy oak doors of Principal Robertson's office, two teachers flanked her like guards escorting a prisoner. One of them knocked sharply before opening the door and ushering her inside. Principal Robertson sat behind his massive desk, his expression a mask of cold fury. His office, decorated with awards and photos of smiling students, felt suffocatingly formal. Aaliyah stood in front of his desk, her hands at her sides, her face calm despite the storm raging around her. "Miss Scott," Robertson began, his voice measured but tinged with anger, "do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," Aaliyah said simply. Robertson's eyes narrowed. "Your actions today were not only disruptive but entirely unacceptable. Burning a uniform in the middle of campus? What were you thinking?" "I was thinking," Aaliyah replied, meeting his gaze, "that no one listens when I speak, so I made them listen another way." Robertson's mouth tightened into a thin line. "This isn't a platform for your personal grievances. Westbridge Academy has rules, and you've broken them in a way that cannot be ignored. Effective immediately, you are suspended." Aaliyah's stomach dropped, but she refused to show any weakness. "You're punishing me for standing up for myself," she said, her voice steady, "but you've done nothing about the people who made me feel like I had no choice." "This isn't a debate," Robertson snapped. "You will leave the campus today, and your father will be informed." Aaliyah nodded once, her jaw tight. Without another word, she turned and left the office. As Aaliyah walked back to her locker to gather her things, the reality of her suspension began to sink in. She had expected consequences, but hearing the words from Principal Robertson had still stung. Her mind raced with thoughts of how her father would react, of what this would mean for her future at Westbridge. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a flood of notifications, texts, tags, and missed calls. Confused, she clicked on one of the links a friend had sent her. It opened a video of her protest, already uploaded to social media. The footage showed her standing in the courtyard, her voice clear and powerful as the blazer burned in her hands. The caption read, "Student burns uniform to protest racism at elite private school." The video had thousands of views and comments. Some praised her bravery, while others criticized her actions as reckless. Aaliyah scrolled through the comments, her emotions swirling as she saw the impact of what she had done. This is the kind of courage we need. What's wrong with these kids today? So entitled. She's an icon. Period. Aaliyah's heart raced. The video had gone viral, and it wasn't just her classmates watching. It was the world. Miles away, in a sleek glass office building overlooking the city, Darius Scott was in the middle of a board meeting when his phone buzzed. He ignored it at first, focused on the presentation in front of him. But when the buzzing didn't stop, his secretary leaned over and whispered, "Mr. Scott, you might want to see this." Darius frowned, picking up his phone. His eyes widened as he watched the video, his daughter's voice ringing out as she stood defiantly in the courtyard. The flames consumed the blazer in her hands, and the crowd around her stood frozen, their phones capturing every second. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "It's everywhere," his secretary replied. "Social media, the news. Your daughter's protest is making waves." Darius felt a surge of conflicting emotions: pride at her courage, anger at the circumstances that had pushed her to this point, and concern for what she must be going through. He stood abruptly, silencing the room. "Cancel the rest of my meetings," he said. "Get the helicopter ready." Back at Westbridge Academy, the courtyard was abuzz with activity. The video of Aliyah's protest had spread across campus, and reporters were beginning to gather outside the gates. Students whispered in clusters, their eyes darting toward the school entrance every few seconds. The sound of rotors broke through the chatter, growing louder until 3 sleek black helicopters appeared in the sky. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the helicopters descended onto the school grounds, their powerful blades kicking up clouds of dust. The doors of the lead helicopter opened, and Darius Scott stepped out, flanked by 2 security guards. His tailored suit and commanding presence made an immediate impression. Students and staff stared in awe as he walked purposefully towards the main building. Inside the office, Principal Robertson looked up from his desk, his face pale. He had heard the commotion outside, but he hadn't expected this. The door opened and Darius entered, his expression calm but unyielding. "Principal Robertson," he said, his voice steady, "we need to talk." Principal Robertson stood as Darius Scott entered the office, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The air in the room felt heavy, the tension palpable as the 2 men faced each other. "Mr. Scott," Robertson began, his voice tight, "I assure you, we're handling the situation with the utmost seriousness." Darius raised an eyebrow, his gaze cold. "Seriousness? My daughter stood up against racism and harassment that your staff ignored for months. And your response was to punish her?" Robertson bristled, his hands clasping the edge of his desk. Her actions were disruptive and inappropriate. Burning a uniform in the middle of the courtyard was the only way she could make herself heard, Darius interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "Your institution failed her, and instead of addressing the real issue, you chose to silence her." "This is a matter of discipline," Robertson argued, though his voice wavered under Darius's scrutiny. "We cannot allow such behavior." "Let me make this clear," Darius said, leaning forward slightly. "You allowed my daughter to be humiliated, mocked, and dismissed under your watch. That's not discipline, it's negligence, and I won't stand for it." The principal opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps and voices outside the office stopped him. A moment later, the door opened and the mayor of the city entered, followed by a swarm of reporters and cameras. "Darius," the mayor greeted, shaking his hand firmly. He turned to Robertson with a neutral but assessing gaze. "Principal Robertson." "Mr. Mayor," Robertson stammered, his confidence visibly shaken. "This is a private matter." "It's a public issue now," the mayor interrupted, his voice steady. He gestured to the reporters who had gathered just outside the office door. "The entire city is watching, and they have questions about how this school handles equality and inclusion." Robertson paled, his hands clenching at his sides. "I assure you, Westbridge Academy is committed to—" "Then why did it take a student's bold protest to reveal the deep issues within your school's culture?" The mayor shot back, his tone sharp. He turned to the cameras, addressing the audience beyond the room. "Education is the great equalizer," the mayor began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Or at least it should be. But too often we see systems designed to favor the privileged while silencing those who dare to challenge the status quo." The reporters' cameras zoomed in, capturing every word. Outside, the growing crowd of students, parents, and onlookers listened intently. Aliyah Scott's protest was not an act of rebellion. It was a cry for justice, the mayor continued. and it revealed the cracks in an institution that prides itself on excellence. Today, we take the first steps toward addressing those cracks, not just here at Westbridge, but across our educational system. The crowd erupted into applause as the mayor finished, his words echoing in the courtyard. The reporters turned their attention back to Principal Robertson, whose face was ashen. Darius stood silently, his imposing presence a reminder that this fight wasn't over. Under the weight of public scrutiny, Robertson's defenses crumbled. I'll submit my resignation, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. The cameras captured his words, sealing his fate. Darius watched him for a moment before turning to the reporters. "This isn't about one man stepping down," he said. "It's about creating a system that protects every student, no matter who they are." In the weeks that followed, Westbridge Academy underwent significant changes. Diversity and inclusion programs were implemented, and anti-bullying policies were strengthened. A new principal was appointed, one who promised to prioritize fairness and equality. Aaliyah returned to school amid a wave of support from her peers. Some apologized for staying silent, while others expressed admiration for her courage. She remained humble, focusing on her studies and using her newfound platform to advocate for others who felt marginalized. One evening, as she and her father sat on the balcony of their home, Aaliyah turned to him. "Dad, do you think I went too far?" Darius looked at her, his expression softening. "Sometimes the only way to be heard is to make noise," he said. "What you did wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and because of you, things are changing." Aaliyah smiled, leaning against him. "I just hope it made a difference." "It did," Darius said firmly, "and I couldn't be prouder of you." Aaliyah's story didn't end with Westbridge. She was invited to speak at events and conferences, sharing her experience and inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Her protest became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that one voice could ignite a movement. But for Aaliyah, the most rewarding part was knowing she had helped create a better environment for future students. As she walked through the courtyard one afternoon, a younger student approached her, their eyes wide with admiration. "Miss Scott," the student said shyly, "thank you for everything." Aaliyah crouched down, meeting their gaze with a warm smile. "Always stand up for what's right," she said, "even when it's hard." As she walked away, the sun shining overhead, Aaliyah felt a sense of peace. She had found her voice, and the world was better for it.